All right. So, starting off, problems of how we do elections today in the U.S. Um, the U.S. election system is uh, pretty complex, actually, because one of our biggest problems, which is our first bullet point here, is that there is actually no one national system. There's no federal standard, actually, for how elections function. Everything about elections, how people vote, how candidates get on the ballot, all that stuff is actually controlled by the states individually. And there is no federal code that says you got to do it a particular way or anything. So there can be a lot of variation in the rules and requirements for people to be able to vote, as well as candidates and parties to be recognized and to be on the ballot so that people can vote for them. So this right here by itself already causes a lot of trouble for a lot of elections throughout the country. Whoops, did it go forward yet? It already causes a lot of trouble for a lot of elections through the country. So I think that's actually on the next slide. So let me kind of run through these points here, and then we'll talk about kind of the solutions to these things. But keep that in mind that there's no federal standard. So when we talk about elections, when we talk about all of these issues going forward here, it varies a lot state by state. So we have to kind of tailor certain things to individual states until there is a federal standard. And frankly, that is part of our demands when we get to the end of this. A lot of folks misunderstand how the party primaries work, especially versus the general election. And the truth is, the general election is actually the real election. It's the election in November, roughly. It depends per state and municipal elections and all that stuff. But roughly speaking, when you vote in November, that's the real election that determines who actually gets into office. But most states have a primary, right? You vote usually earlier in the year, in spring or maybe early summer, and you vote in the primary. And a lot of folks think like, oh, there's just a primary election. And it's kind of weird because technically speaking, that's a private vote, because the political parties, according to U.S. law and court orders and things like that, are private entities. They're not part of the government. So those primaries actually don't follow a lot of the same rules. They actually don't even have the same protections that the general election does. So you could see a lot of weirdness in how the primaries run. And of course, that really comes to a head in presidential election years when everyone is really paying attention. But even in other years, the fact that there's a separate primary process from the general election makes even more confusion about how the rules work. And of course, people confuse that primary as if it's a real official thing, and it's kind of not, although kind of is, just because the duopoly owns government. So of course, they've set rules so that the government pays for their own primary. So it's in this weird quasi-public, but not really public status. So we mentioned
public welfare and money basically going to right. Private, not-for-profit corporations, which is what a political party is. Right. A political party, including the Green Party, because we're legally required to be this, is a 527 not-for-profit. It's a special political brand of not-for-profit. You don't get a tax break, but we also don't pay taxes. So yeah, it's one of those wonderful areas of U.S. capitalism and U.S. politics where the parties in power have leveraged the public coffers and public resources to maintain and support the private primaries, caucuses, conventions, whatever it is in your particular state. That's being paid for by the public. And one of the most egregious things about this is that because the major parties set the rules, often third parties aren't allowed to participate. Mm-hmm. So in Illinois, where we don't have partisan registration, we have what's called a semi-closed system. You go in, you can't register with anybody, and you go in on your primary day and you say, I want this party's ballot. And in Illinois, in everywhere except for Cook County, which is the Chicago area, the Green Party does not have a primary ballot because we're not a recognized party outside of Cook County. So oftentimes when I go to that spring primary, which is usually in March or April, I walk in and I'd say, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, so I almost always ask for and I can't get a green ballot where I live. And I ask for a nonpartisan ballot, and often I'm turned away. I'm completely disenfranchised because the only options of ballots to grab to ask for are Republican or Democrat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that happens in Pennsylvania too, where you've got to register ahead of time in Pennsylvania with a party to be able to vote in the primary. But then they do confusing things like there'll be voter referendums or constitutional amendments or things like that you can vote on, and they'll place that in the primary election. And so you're technically allowed to go there and ask for an independent ballot to vote on those things because everyone is allowed to vote for it. But again, because of our confusing distinction between primaries and generals and whether you got to be registered or not, like most of the time people don't even know. A lot of times the poll workers themselves get confused when you ask them for an independent ballot, because they're just not used to it. They're trained in the duopoly structure, right? That's what they expect.
And not to disparage poll workers who are unpaid,
No.
Often underpaid and unpaid, but they're also often partisan. I live in Illinois, so we've got Chicago politics, and and then Garrett's in Pennsylvania, where I learned Philly gives Chicago a run for its money. But in 2018, I believe Sherry Hankala, who is the 2012 Green vice presidential candidate, was running for state house in Philadelphia. And I mean, people went to jail, right? Poll workers went to jail because of their behavior during that election. And it included things like changing the votes that were cast on paper ballots. Here in Illinois, we've had instances in Cook County where we are a recognized party, where people have walked in and said, I would like a green ballot. And they get handed the Democratic Party ballot on green paper. And they printed the Green Party ballot on brown paper. And they did that intentionally to try to trick people so that when you came in and you asked for the green ballot, they gave you the green colored ballot unless you explicitly said you wanted the Green Party ballot, right? And this is the poll workers. And some of that is probably confusion, right? They think you're asking for a color, and some of that is definitely malicious. We're talking about Chicago area. This is a, Democratic machine party stronghold. So the kind of insidiousness of the public funding of private primaries, runs very deep from the theoretical level all the way down to the actual functioning of the election workers.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess we'll move on from that, but just that's an important topic that I think doesn't get talked about enough when electoral reform comes up. So when you're keeping in mind that there's no federal standard, this is the kind of thing that results that you get lots of confusion with voters, with poll workers, with everybody in the system, just because it's weird. And it's intentionally not designed to be fair. So moving on from those points, the last bits that are kind of the most important when it comes to ranked choice are the way that we vote, the method we actually vote, which is that when you finally get your ballot, assuming it's the correct ballot and all that stuff, you're only allowed to vote for one candidate at a time. You have to pick one candidate, and we count the votes using typically a plurality system. Whoever has the most votes wins, although some places will do runoffs with the top two candidates if they don't reach a certain threshold, but that's not everywhere.
And it's not at all for the federal elections.
And it's not for federal elections. It's more local, or state offices. So, and the combination of those two factors there, with the plurality voting and the voting for only one candidate and all, is what ends up leading to the so-called spoiler effect, where people feel like they only get one vote, they got to make it count, and so they're talked into this logic of I have to vote for the lesser evil or otherwise it doesn't count. So that's the kind of myth that we want to dispel, and we want to put forward solutions that'll really, really deal with that as we go further, right?
Yeah, and those two things also lead to the problem of a large portion, a large minority is unrepresented. Often it's a majority is unrepresented, right? If it's a three or four candidate race, oftentimes the winner won't get 50%. which means that the majority of the people in the district are not getting represented in the election.
And as one more comment to throw into this before we move on to discussing solutions and all, is that this often comes up, of course, in context of independent and green candidates, but this is actually even a problem in the Republican and Democratic primaries themselves. Donald Trump in 2016, there was a whole field of like 20-something Republican candidates. The first few states in the primary, Donald Trump won like 20% of the vote or something like that. But because of these plurality systems and that the electoral votes are often handed, all of the winner takes all, right? Donald Trump was winning primaries with like 20% of the vote. What that means in actuality is like 80% of the Republican Party actually did not vote for him. They didn't choose him, at least as not their first option. But he ended up becoming the nominee because of this system. So we have to keep that in mind too. I think that it's obviously hurting our ability to run independent politics, but it also contributes to the spoiler effect and all, but kind of propping up a lot of these really terrible candidates because we don't have a better voting system.